2023 is the year where comic book movies imploded, and now Hollywood are asking themselves why? How did it all go so wrong so fast? We all know the answer. Marvel went all in on wokeness, diversity, equity and inclusion. But Hollywood can't admit that. So let's see how the industry trades try to explain this away. In their December 30th piece, Variety, in not so many words, blames the comic book movie collapse on divine intervention. Yeah, for real, it's right there in the title, why the fall of comic book movie culture is inevitable. Inevitable means there's nothing you can do to prevent it, no matter what you do or how hard you try, so right there in the title you can see where this is going. The implication of that title alone is that no one really did anything wrong. Comic book movies had their time, that time is up, and it would have been no matter what. This is kind of like whenever a producer or Hollywood-adjacent pundit says any given production is cursed. It's a means of shifting blame away from the producers, creatives and decision makers, because whenever a production is cursed, what that actually means is that bad decisions were made early on, and those decisions, directly and indirectly, continued to wreak havoc on everything that followed. But rather than admit, we fucked up and have no one to blame but ourselves, it is so much more comfortable to shift the blame onto the supernatural. And that is kind of what this headline implies is about to happen in this article. Let's get into it. The Variety piece reads, comic book movie culture didn't just stumble this year, it face-planted, giving us one movie after another that fans didn't much care about and that the corporations backing these films took a disquieting loss on. And that's not how it was supposed to go. According to the gospel of 21st century Hollywood, the words comic book film and box office disappointment are not supposed to appear in the same sentence. When they do, not just once, but over and over and over again, the tea leaves are telling us something ominous and maybe definitive. Okay, let's stop right here, because there are a few things of note in there. First of all, according to the gospel, comic book movies aren't supposed to fail, right? That's Hollywood gospel. Simply by virtue of being a comic book movie, it should not fail. And yet, this year, to one degree or another, they all did. Even Guardians of the Galaxy Part 3, as even it underperformed relative to expectations. This is where Variety should be asking themselves, what did we, Hollywood, do different with these movies now that we didn't do before? But instead of asking that perhaps painful question, Variety instead wants to read tea leaves. And reading tea leaves is what you do when you try to interpret what you don't already know. Case in point, we on the outside read tea leaves when we try to interpret what Hollywood is doing and how the decision makers there are thinking. By contrast, Hollywood already knows what they are thinking, so when they read tea leaves, it's them trying to interpret the audience. So already here, we know who is being blamed for the comic book movie collapse. You, the audience. The article continues. The analysis that has mostly been offered is simple. The movie companies served up mediocre superhero product. That's why they, and we, because remember, Variety is Hollywood, suffered. If it had just been one or two duds, the situation might have been explained away. But when you think back on Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantuamania, and Shazam Fury of the Gods, and The Flash, and The Marvels, and Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, the pattern is clear. It's not simply a Marvel thing or a DC thing. The primal thrill and popularity of comic book movie culture took a major hit, and it may be fading away. And yet, in the very drubbing these movies received at the box office and in the drumbeat snark of critical reviews, you might say there's hope. Comic book movie culture is, after all, only as good as the movies it gives us. And this was the year that the corporations, let's name names, Disney and Warner Brothers, failed. They made bad movies. What's this? An admission that the movies weren't up to par? That is most uncharacteristic of a studio mouthpiece like Variety. Let's read on and see what kind of game they're playing here. What if they'd made good movies? The temptation to point a finger at the producers and executives and vilify them for their shoddy product has always been there, but now it's part of the new couch potato rebel culture. Ah, I see where they're going here. Seeing that people like us are correctly pointing our fingers at the executives, Variety instantly runs cover and dismisses us as couch potato rebel culture. Anything to protect the executives. Let's read on. Critics, on their reflexive high horse, mostly hate comic book movies, and more they have used their reviews of them to chastise the man, i.e. the executives. The fans would seem to be on the other side of the fence, but they have their own collective resentments and rebel fire. This year, the critics and the Comic-Con horde stood shoulder to shoulder, joining forces to look the suits in the eye and say, "You did this to us. We're bored as hell, and we're not gonna take it anymore." This is what Variety is kind of trying to rubbish, but in actuality that is what happened. Moving on. All that said, there's a larger reality about comic book movie culture that we tend to ignore. So let's state it outright. This shit is starting to fail because it's spent. Because it's been used up. I'm not just talking about Ant-Man or The Flash. I'm talking about the characters who got us in the door in the first place. The iconic, larger-than-life ones. Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, Wonder Woman, Captain America, Thor, the Hulk, Black Panther. They were the mythic engine of this thing. And for a good long stretch, we didn't just want to see them on screen, we craved it. We needed them to be our gods again. And they were, until they weren't. Memo to James Gunn. Gods have a way of losing power when you stick them in reruns. From there, the article begins to ramble, so I'll summarize the point it's trying to make. There's too much comic book movie content. The market is saturated, and from here on out, the author actually makes a few good points. So no, comic book movie culture isn't on life support. Yet. Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, was certainly right when he acknowledged, in an act of damage control, that the MCU has spread itself too thin, diluting its appeal with spin-off TV series and a general sense of the multiverse as something that was becoming homework even for fans. Yet, what's the solution? There's no real way to put the genie of too much product overkill back in the bottle, because the only way to solve that problem is with more product. James Gunn, in his role as the executive guru along with Peter Safran of DC Studios, now ready to wipe the slate clean and launch a new universe of DC storytelling, wants to fix it all with quality control. He's basically saying, fuck those Zack Snyder movies. My Superman will be boss. Yes, except that his Superman is going to feel like it's about the 12th Superman. I can't fault this part of the analysis. The big problem for James Gunn's DC reboot is the proximity to the previous DC movies, which did nothing but harm the DC brand. Several years should ideally have passed between Aquaman 2 and the upcoming Superman reboot, but in the current media landscape, that ain't happening. The article then concludes, the executives, sitting in their Death Star suites, were full of excuses this year. The movie got rushed into production, we overextended ourselves, and no one can blame them for the personal and legal implosion of Jonathan Majors. Well, actually I can and I have, but moving on. At the same time, the critical rebel establishment, speaking more than ever for fans, saw blood in the water, and with it the opportunity to help kill off the comic book movie culture it has come to regard as an existential threat to cinema. But if that culture is now entering the early stages of its death throes, it will actually be for an honorable reason. Comic book movies were never going to die because an Ant-Man or Captain Marvel sequel was bad. The only reason they were going to die is that they had served their purpose. They made us dream of men and women in capes who could fly and who seemed indestructible, because all of that made us feel good. But then it stopped making us feel so good, because we had already been there and dreamed that. And it was time, perhaps, to get back to reality. Yeah, that was some sanctimonious drivel, and you'll note that at no point in that article was any real reason given as to why these movies failed, other than that there's too many of them and the vague notion that they had their time. But why? They were delighting audiences, more and more, all over the planet, across languages, genders, and cultures. So why did audiences stop watching these movies, just as they were becoming so incredibly inclusive that everyone could see themselves in them? Well, let's take a brief look at what this article failed to address. My good friend Cultured Casino sent me a few articles from several years ago that should be illuminating, like this one from Screen Rant, published June 26th of 2018, when Marvel pumped out billion-dollar movies left and right, the same year that even Aquaman grossed $1 billion. This story reads that the MCU will soon have more female heroes than male heroes, as Kevin Feige envisions a time when audiences have stopped talking about Marvel heroes as male or female, and that more than half of them will be female. This, of course, was not too long after Kevin Feige had allied himself with Bob Iger to get rid of Ike Perlmutter and the Marvel Creative Committee, which up till that point had kept the MCU on purpose to the delight of audiences, Disney shareholders, and third-party licensees alike. But without them there keeping Kevin Feige in check, this was when he could begin giving in to his woke impulses and make the MCU all about social justice with little regard for continuity, and that's when it all started going to hell. And as we saw with the Marvels, it was especially women worldwide that walked away. Remember, female audiences fell in love with Captain America, Thor, and Iron Man. No one but Kevin Feige and Victoria Alonso thought that making the MCU female-centric would bring in more women. The proof is now in the pudding, and it didn't. Quite the contrary. DC always had struggles of their own, but I've always maintained that the MCU and the goodwill of those movies helped float even the struggling DCEU. But when the MCU went woke and the DCEU movies all had to manage on their own merit, audiences stayed away in droves, and that's what happened to comic book movies in 2023. It didn't have to be this way, and it wouldn't have been were it not for the executives at Marvel, Disney, and to a lesser extent DC, certainly the previous administration that made the 2023 movies. It's unfortunate that the Hollywood trades refuse to print this simple explanation of what really went wrong. Here's to hoping that even if they won't say it out loud, the powers that be still know deep inside. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments.